was the prominent man of letters, A.N. Wilson, who was proud of his newfound atheism. Having dinner with the noted atheist Christopher Hitchens in D.C. in the late 1980s, he writes, "I didn't have to feel out on a limb. Hitchens was excited to greet a new convert to unbelief and put me through a catechism before uncorking some stupendous claret. So, absolutely no God? Nope. I was able to say with Mooney-like zeal, no future life, nothing out there? No, I replied." Wilson didn't stop at this. He began, in his own words, to rail against Christianity. He wrote a very popular book that described Jesus as, quote, a messianic prophet who had truly failed and died. Another of his books, titled God's Funeral, outlined the collapse of human faith in God. He insisted that Christianity rose or fell based upon the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, and therefore it must die. Until Easter of 2009, when A.N. Wilson published his own story of how he had become disillusioned with his atheism and concluded that his atheism could not account for the human experience. It could not account for poetry or for human language. It could not account for music. It could not account for love. The death knell for Wilson's atheism came as he researched a new book on Wagner and the Nazis, and he considered what kind of society is created by people who believe ethics to be a mere human construct. In contrast, he could look at a Christian like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who went to his death with such courage and such peace, facing a hangman's noose for standing against Nazism. Now Wilson says that Christianity lives because it does rise or fall based on the resurrection, and Christ historically has risen from the dead. The resurrection, he now writes, which proclaims that matter and spirit are mysteriously conjoined, is the ultimate key to who we are. He writes, the more I read the Easter story, the better it seems to fit and apply to the human condition. Wilson began, to sense that what he instinctively felt was the case, that human beings are more than mere physical animated cadavers, more than animated pieces of meat, that we are spiritual. And he came to believe that that was actually true, and that the resurrection of Jesus Christ alone could make sense of the complexity, the beauty, and the shame of the human experience. In some ways, Wilson's story reflects my own conversion from atheism to follow Jesus while studying architecture at the University of Virginia. There is something about the resurrection of the Son of God that connects with the bass string of the human heart and makes it reverberate in a way that nothing else can. It gives us a confidence that this life is not meaningless and that we are not living an absurdity. We're going to read the account from the Gospel according to St. Mark. This is the 16th chapter. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance to the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled away. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him, but go and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And when Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him and who were mourning and weeping. And when they heard that Jesus was alive and that she had seen him, they didn't believe it. Afterward, Jesus appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they were walking in the country. These returned and reported it to the rest, but they still did not believe them either. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. And he said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned." What do we see here? Well, first, we see a historical account that has the hallmark of actually being true, that is actually factual. Why do I say this? Well, first notice who the first witnesses of the resurrection were. It was Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome, who first went and discovered that the tomb had already opened up and that Jesus was not there, and were told that he had risen. These first witnesses were all women. The first human witnesses to the central fact of Christianity, were all female. And beyond that, then the first eyewitness of the resurrected Jesus to actually see him was Mary Magdalene, we read. So how is that significant? It's significant because this was produced to document a historical account produced within a highly misogynistic culture that did not view women as having any legal credibility in a court of law. Both pagans and Pharisaical Jewish leaders attacked the early Christians and the gospel because they said that the first witnesses were female and therefore, from their perspective, not reliable. You see, if the early Christians had been inventing an account of the resurrection of Jesus, they would not have invented something that for 19 centuries was considered a liability. They would have had men be the first witnesses because they're credible, men of stature, and probably if they were really just trying to advance their own power and control over the nascent church, they would have made the apostles the first witnesses and would not have put an account of the apostles cowering and weeping and disbelieving first 3 and then another couple witnesses. Jesus having to rebuke the leaders of the early church. You see, there's no way they would have fabricated an account like this unless it's actually how it happened and they felt morally bound to tell the truth. And so it has a hallmark of fact. This isn't the kind of document that would have been produced spuriously. And so we have this strong historical case. And if it is, if Jesus really was raised from the dead, you can kind of think, oh, there's all sorts of stuff I don't like in the Bible, so I don't believe that. But you don't want to be the person saying that because I don't like a moral teaching in the Bible, therefore Jesus could not have physically risen from the dead. We don't want to go there. But the thing is, if you conclude that he did, then you have to deal with that. It's weird because the way people today make religious decisions and convictions about what they believe is so different from the way most of humanity has made those decisions. Today we kind of think, well, here's an idea, and I kind of like it, and it feels good to me, and it feels right, therefore I'm going to believe that to be true. That's not how they did it back then. You think of St. Paul himself, the apostle to the Gentiles. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees, a highly trained, under Gamaliel himself, highly trained Jewish scholar. He hated Christianity. No one hated Christianity more than St. Paul. He loathed it. He was there at the execution of the Christian deacon Stephen, giving his approval to it. He hated the way Christians mixed men and women together as equals. He hated the way that Christians failed to observe the Jewish food laws. He hated the way that Christians treated the Sabbath. He hated the way that Christians elevated and worshiped Jesus of Nazareth as if he were God. Paul actively persecuted the Christians. He wanted them dead. He found Christianity morally, aesthetically, and theologically reprehensible until he came face to face with Jesus on a horse on a road between Jerusalem and Damascus, Syria, and he got knocked off his horse and saw the glorified, resurrected Jesus who spoke to him and called him to himself. And he said, I hate this. This isn't what I want. I look inside myself. I don't want this to be true, but it's true, and I have to deal with it. And so he followed Jesus all the days of his life. Because he wasn't looking inside his heart to see how he felt. He was looking at reality and concluding that what is true must be lived out. It's a totally different way of making decisions. Back in the 1980s, a Israeli Jewish scholar, actually looked at the question, Pinchas Lapid, of Jesus of Nazareth from a Jewish perspective. He was not a Jew for Jesus, he was a Jew for Judaism. And he looked at it historically, because, science can't answer a question of whether or not somebody rose from the dead. Science is the study of repeatable events. And science can tell you that, as a general rule, when people die, they stay dead, but it can't account for non-repeatable events. There is a study of human knowledge and experience that does focus on non-repeatable events. It's the field of history. And Lapid looked at this as a question of history. Science can't answer whether Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, but historians can if they have enough data. And years ago, Pinchas Lapid noted how, while Jews in the first century had a widely held expectation of a resurrection of the dead at the end of history, no one, not even the apostles, were expecting it to happen to someone in the middle of history. And he noted the gospel accounts, their extreme counterproductive honesty, the way that the Christian's Messiah says on the cross while he's dying that God is forsaking him. That's not how you inspire confidence in a leader. How the apostles are depicted as unbelieving idiots. It's not what you do when you're wanting to build your church. This passage that Jesus is rebuking the Christian leaders for their lack of faith and stubborn refusal to believe, and then he looks at and he says, nobody would have made this up. Clearly, these early followers of Jesus believed that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And then Pinchas Lapid, this Jewish scholar, looked at the transformation of 11 disciples who were cowering in unbelief and fear in a room. Even it was the women who had to go deal with the burial of Jesus. They were so afraid. And he looks how in an instant that group of 11 people was transformed into courageous, confident, men. 10 of the 11 of them went to their death to spread the good news that Jesus had risen from the dead. And he concludes, Pinchas Lapid, that it would take a far larger miracle to explain the early Christians than a mere resurrection from the dead. It's a strong case historically that this man Jesus was dead and then became alive again after really being dead because Roman executioners were really good at their job. So we see a historical account that has some hallmarks of fact. So I want to ask you a question. What if it's all true? See, in our busyness, we often miss the wonder of the universe in which we live. Brett Bodorf works at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station in Antarctica, and he writes about his experience of the beauty of God in such a remote place. He says, "My best moments during the winter here are spent walking outside where isolation and darkness meet. I pause to reflect on God's vast infiniteness, gazing at a crystal clear view of the Milky Way and the constellations that are invisible back home." We've got a photo of that station in Antarctica and the sky above. He says, stepping outside in a 90-degree below zero Fahrenheit weather is daunting, but every moment in the wild, I feel God's overwhelming presence as I'm made aware of his transcendence. He writes, "I enjoy learning about the sciences that explore the vastness of space, but the more I learn, the more I see the intricate hand of God weaving this tapestry in the sky. One person on the station told me it was absurd amidst all the infinite wonder to believe in a God who would be bothered with such an inconsequential planet, let alone the people on it. But gazing into the unbridled magnificence of our galaxy, I feel anything but irrelevant to God. Quite the opposite. I feel God's tender grasp." We've got a video here. It says, "The most unique of my outdoor experiences at the South Pole has been standing beneath the aurora australis. Even with a scientific understanding of what causes this phenomena, It is easy to stand in awe of a creator who moves beyond simple function and into indescribable beauty. Lindsay Whaley, a professor of classics and linguistics at Dartmouth, agrees. Whaley writes, "Billions of people around the world celebrate Jesus' resurrection, but can we really take it seriously? Or is Christianity, as cosmologist Stephen Hawking once put it, a fairy story for people who are afraid of the dark?" Resurrection is a concept that is even intellectually responsible in the 21st century. After all, we know that death leads to decomposition, which means we become dirt. Again, Stephen Hawking wrote, "I regard the brain as a computer which will stop working when its components fail. There is no heaven or afterlife for broken down computers." But what if the wonder and the beauty of the cosmos are in fact signs that there is more to this experience than is dreamt of in our philosophy? Whaley continues, "For me, the resurrection requires one external hypothesis, that there is a God who can perform miracles. And in a Western university setting, belief in God can seem far-fetched, let alone belief in the resurrection. Perhaps the story of Jesus is a comforting story for people who are afraid of the dark. But, as Oxford professor C.S. Lewis wrote it, the story of Christ is simply a true myth. A myth working on us the same way as other myths, but with this tremendous difference that in reality it actually happened." Are we ready to ask ourselves whether we can really live as if death is final, as if there is no God? Can we really live knowing that the sun eventually burns out and that billions of years from now there will be no one there to know whether we even existed or to find any significance to that reality? That we will have just been a random and meaningless blip in history that has no true story, no climax, no significance, no falling action, just a gnat that got squashed underfoot, just a collection of atoms whizzing about briefly in a random way that happens to develop sentience before going out forever. Can you live as if there's no God? No way it's supposed to be, no good, no evil, no right, no wrong. Can you live as if there's no difference between a head of cabbage and a head of a child, because they're just matter plus time plus chance? Can you live as if there's nothing ultimately evil about what the Nazis did in the 1940s, or about Islamic State throwing gay men off the tops of tall buildings in Iraq, or about the American experience of race-based chattel slavery? That there is no ultimate meaning to reading your child a bedtime story or holding the hand of a grandmother as she passes from this life. I have known plenty of atheists, I used to be one, and they don't live like that. They have integrity, they have concern for human suffering, but it's borrowed capital. They're living as if human life really has meaning and really is sacred, as if truth is superior to deception, as if love actually is the universal objective moral norm, whether we recognize it or not, as if there really is ultimate meaning and purpose to this life, as if we have significance, as if there really were a God who is actually behind all of it. You can't live as if it's all really meaningless. At the 2016 Isaac Asimov Memorial Debate at the American Museum of Natural History, the question of whether or not the universe is a simulation was addressed. Astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, who was hosting the debate, said that he thinks the likelihood of the universe being a simulation may, in his words, be very high. He says he wouldn't be surprised if we were to find out somehow that someone else is responsible for our universe. Tyson uses a thought experiment to imagine a life form that's as much smarter than us as we are to dogs, chimpanzees, or other terrestrial animals. What would we look like to them, he asks. We would be drooling, blithering idiots in their presence. Whatever that being is, it very well might be able to create a simulation of a universe in which we are a part of the simulation, not realizing we are part of a simulation. Tyson goes on to say, and if that is the case, it's easy for me to imagine that everything in our lives is just the creation of some other entity for their entertainment. Tyson writes, I'm saying the day we learn that it's true, I will be the only one in the room saying, I'm not surprised. If you can see evidence that the universe is a simulation run by an unimaginably intelligent and superior outside intelligence, is the thought of a God so outlandish. And would such a God, if it exists, not be able to resurrect the dead? You know, current research suggests that space and time had a beginning about 14 billion years ago, though in recent months there's additional research that might mean it was actually a little further back than that. It has to do with questions whether dark matter exists, and we won't get into all of that. But, you know, there wasn't, within this model, an empty void in the beginning. There was nothing. And then space and time exploded into existence at one moment. If you can think of what nothing is, I want you to picture nothing in your mind, and then I want you to get rid of that, because that's something. Nothing is what Jonathan Edwards said, nothing is what sleeping rocks dream of, meaning nothing. Nothing existed, and then space and time began expanding outward at an incredible rate. You could speculate about multiverses and prior universes, but you know, research indicates that it had a beginning. Currently, there are 10 billion galaxies in the observable universe. The number of stars in a galaxy varies, but assuming an average of 100 billion stars per galaxy means that there are about 1 billion trillion stars in the observable universe. And the Bible says that there is an intelligence, an outside intelligence, who set all that in motion and transcends it, is larger than that. We're not talking about an ancient Near Eastern sky god. You know, the scriptures say that this power, this intelligence, what we only know partly and call God, also sustains the universe in its immensity, moment by moment, maintaining its existence by the very word of his power. Do you think that the death of a human brain is an obstacle for such a being? Do you think such a being couldn't, as your computer breaks down, couldn't upload all of your software and data into a bubble universe when your hardware breaks down and fails you? Our souls, our data and programs and sentience and all that soulishness that makes up so much more than us being a few dollars worth of chemicals. Maybe our hardware will die. Maybe we are computers breaking down to be replaced someday, but Jesus speaks of our software being uploaded temporarily to a place called heaven or paradise or the heavenly mainframe, if you will. And he says to the thief on the cross next to him, "This day you're going to be with me in paradise." Paul says that to be away from the body is to be at home with the Lord. What if it's all true? If it is true, then we have here a personal challenge from Jesus that we have to deal with. If it's not true, it doesn't matter. Quit worrying yourself. Eat, drink, you won't exist soon. But if it's true, then we have this personal challenge from Jesus. He said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned." It's a sobering challenge from Jesus of Nazareth, a personal challenge saying that humanity is already condemned because of what we've done with the world and how we've treated God and each other. And yet he's saying that if you come to me and believe me and trust me, you will be saved. A promise of salvation, of good news, a good message, literally, an euangelon, a good message, a joyful message about, well, you ask, Greg, how is it a joyful message that Jesus of Nazareth was gruesomely tortured and murdered on a cross? It's good news because he willingly did that as our substitute in order to carry the weight of our sin and our failure and our shame and our crimes, taking them and taking the punishment in our place. It's a very, very good Friday in order to give us the eternal life that he alone deserved. It's the good news of salvation. If you believe and are baptized, you will be saved. This is what J.R.R. Tolkien called an eucatastrophe. An eucatastrophe, literally a good disaster, is the kind of story that we keep writing and have been writing for human history, where there's an incredibly hopeless situation and a victory is snatched from the jaws of defeat through the ministration of someone who comes in weakness, and their weakness ends up being their true power, and it brings them victory. And And Tolkien says that there's a kind of catastrophe of catastrophes, a joyful disaster of joyful disasters in the gospel of Jesus Christ himself, that by dying on the cross, he purchases eternal life for all who will believe and follow him. It's a radical claim from Jesus, a claim on your life, telling you to come and believe. And as a pastor, I can't shield you from him. Tolkien says there's a bass string to the human heart, and these kinds of stories that we tell, they can make that bass string of the heart reverberate a little bit, but they can't actually prick it. But Tolkien says the gospel is the only story that will actually pluck that bass string such that the whole heart never stops reverberating and vibrating with joy. The reason it'll reverberate is that this is the reality to which all those other stories are pointing, that it actually happened in real life. There really was a hero from outside who came, whose weakness ended up becoming his strength, and who defeated the villain fully and finally and forever to bring salvation. That reality, Tolkien says, is Jesus. And that promise comes with an embodied hope, that just as Jesus defeated death, so those who die united to Jesus in faith will also one day rise, that death will not be able to hold you down. Your sentience will continue in the heavenly mainframe and in heaven itself until such time as Christ raises all the dead, and you will rise to life eternal with him with a fully embodied existence. Jesus broke the power of death through his resurrection, and this is not just a future hope of some coming age. Jesus has the power to change you right here and right now. All these people who Jesus encountered here, these women, the 11 apostles, they all spent their lives following Jesus. They encountered him, and it changed their life. Seeing the resurrected Jesus changed their lives forever, because Jesus is a powerful rescuer, more powerful than death itself. He has the authority and power to change a life, not just in the future, but right now. These women radically transformed. These disciples went to their death with the hope and the confidence and the joy of those who know that they are eternally saved. Throughout history, we see individuals rescued by Jesus bring changes into people who then love their enemies, forgive those who have hurt them, live lives set free from bitterness, from anger, from addiction, set free by Jesus, the resurrected Jesus who has the power to change our lives, the resurrection Jesus who calls us to himself. It's a radical life that Jesus brings to those who will follow him. Amber Geiger is a former Dallas police officer who has been found guilty in the murder of Botham Jean. The case became a national story because of the circumstances surrounding the crime, which included allegations of racism. Geiger is white, and she was a police officer. Botham Jean was black. Geiger shot and killed him in his own home, alleging that she had mistakenly entered the wrong apartment and thought that he was burgling her apartment. Geiger has been sentenced to 10 years in prison. Many people outside the courtroom have decried that sentence, insisting that it's far too lenient, insisting inside the courtroom that justice must be done. And yet in that courtroom there was another voice that was heard. Brant, whose brother Botham Jean was the one killed. We've got a video of Brant at the end of that trial. That's the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ, because Jesus is alive and at large on planet Earth today, and he has power to take a life of bitterness and make it a life of love, to take a life of fear and replace it with a life of confidence, that take a life of just getting by and make it a life filled with joy and confidence in the mission of God. That's the power of a young man who knows Jesus, and in his pain and in his loss and in his sorrow, he has found freedom to love his enemy, to love the one who destroyed his brother's life. Rescued people only want to rescue other people. You can't love like that unless you have been loved yourself. And Brant forgave Amber Geiger for killing his brother because Brant knew he had been forgiven himself. The weeping in the courtroom was palpable, with even the judge wiping tears from her own eyes. According to CNN, shortly afterwards, the judge, the Honorable Tammy Kemp, handed Geiger a Bible to take with her and said, "You can have mine. I have 3 or 4 more at home. This is the one I use every day, and this is your job for the next month. This is where you start. In John chapter 3, verse 16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but shall have eternal life." That is the power of the good news of Jesus, who defeated sin and death for us. Brant sees it, and it set him free to live a life of radical love and compassion. Jesus Christ is risen and at large today. He is risen with healing in his wings. It is not a fairy tale. It is a fact, and it can change your life forever. Let's pray.